Hi, my name is David Kelsey, and today we're going to be working some practice exercises for categorical logic. And in particular, what we're going to be working on is using the rules method to evaluate the validity of categorical syllogisms. And it's a bit of a tricky one. So we want, personally, I think practice makes perfect when it comes to this particular set of lesson, So I think we've got a number of examples we'll be working today. Hopefully this helps you see, the point and it sinks in a bit more. So, okay, so the first example here, it says, because all shrubs are ornamental plants, it follows that no ornamental plants are cacti, since no cacti qualify as shrubs, right? Now, you can see here in this example, so there's a couple things to point out. First, this argument isn't just handed to you in a formalized structure, right? So you actually have to determine here what the conclusion is, what the premises are. You have to determine the form of those claims, right? Whether they're A, E, I, or O, and then also what the terms are, right? So there's a kind of method that works, I think, really well, an organized step-by-step process that we can use to get us through, the formalization of the argument and then the evaluation, okay? And so that's what we're going to sort of practice here. The first step is going to be to name your terms. You want to name your terms. I think it's really pretty straightforward with this example, but later on, I think with some of the terms will be a lot more complex, and it won't be as easy or straightforward. But here, right, we can see that the first claim says, the first sort of bit of the argument says, because all shrubs are ornamental plants, right? So we have there the term shrubs and ornamental plants, right? Those are pretty straightforward. What we'll do is we'll name those terms S and O, okay? Then lastly, we have, if you notice the next part of the passage here, it says it follows that no ornamental plants are cacti. So then our terms here are going to be shrubs, ornamental plants, and cacti, right? And we'll name those S, O, and C, right? C for cacti, O for ornamental plants, and S for shrubs. And so what we do then is, instead of working with the longer terms, we just work with the letters, right? We abbreviate the categories with letters, and so we just work with the letters S, O, and C here, right? So that's how we start our process, right? So step one is name your terms, okay? So then step two, once we name our terms, what we want to do is we want to actually find the conclusion of the argument. We want to figure out the form of it, and then we want to place the terms in it, and that's the next step, okay? So if you read through the example, the best thing to do to spot the conclusion of the argument is to look for a kind of indicator. Most of these passages that we'll look at will have a kind of phrase or a word in there that will kind of, point out a conclusion, right? We call these conclusion indicators. So if you look here, it says, because all shrubs are ornamental plants, it follows that no ornamental plants are cacti, right? And it follows that phrase, it follows that is a conclusion indicator. And so that means that no ornamental plants are cacti is the conclusion of our argument, right? And so that's going to be, once we, sort of plug in our terms and we get the form of it right, no ornamental plants or cacti becomes no O or C, right? No O or C. It's pretty straightforward. Okay, so now that we've got our conclusion, no O or C, right, let's find the premises. So the first bit of this passage, again, it says, because all shrubs are ornamental plants. That seems pretty clearly the claim, all S are O, right? So we'll have that as our first premise, all S are O. Then the last bit of this passage, it says, since no cacti qualify as shrubs. No cacti qualify as shrubs. That to me reads like an E claim, no C or S. Okay? And so that's our argument, right? All S are O, no C or S, therefore no O or C. And you look at it like that, once it's got those letters, right, plugged in, it's really pretty straightforward and simple. It just looks like, a bit like math almost, right? Okay, so now if we gotten to this point, right, where we've got our argument organized and correctly stated, formalized, what we've got to do is apply the rules, right? So the first rule, it says, rule 1, the negatives must match, right? You can see here that the second premise is negative, but so is the conclusion, right? They're both E claims. So rule 1's going to pass. Secondly, the second rule says that the middle term's got to be distributed. If you notice, the middle term is S here, right? The shrubs term. And that's occurring as the subject of an A claim in the first premise and the predicate of an E claim in the second. But if you think back to the rules about distribution, actually, A claims distribute just the subject term and E claims distribute both terms. So actually, the shrubs term, the middle term, is distributed by both premises, and so rule 2 passes here as well. So what about rule 3 then, right? Rule 3 says that any term distributed in the conclusion must be distributed in the premises. You can see that the conclusion here is an E claim, right? No O or C. That's going to distribute both of those terms, and so we've got to check both the O term and the C term in the premises to determine if they're distributed there as well. And if so, then the third rule would pass, and then this argument would be actually valid. Okay, so what about the O term? The O term occurs in the first premise as the predicate of an A claim. As the predicate of an A claim. If you remember back, A claims only distribute the subject term, right? So the O term here, not distributed in the first premise. So we have then a term that's distributed in the conclusion, ornamental plants, but not distributed in the first premise, right? And so the third rule is actually going to fail. So this argument is going to be invalid, right? The second example we're going to look at, and again here what we're doing is we're evaluating, we're testing categorical syllogisms to see if they're valid, and we're using what's called the rules method, which is a really simple way to determine if a categorical syllogism is valid. Again, you just have to check these 3 rules against it. But the passage here is going to read, rats are disease-carrying pests, and as such should be eradicated because such pests should all be eradicated. You can see here that your terms would be rats, which we can abbreviate with R, the term R, the letter R, and then disease-carrying pests, which we can label D, and then lastly, the term, you can kind of, this last term is a bit tricky, I think. It says rats are disease-carrying pests and as such should be eradicated. So we have to somehow capture should be eradicated in a term. So the way we're going to do that is with the term pests that should be eradicated, right? We have to make it into a noun phrase. So pests that should be eradicated will do the job, right? So we'll call that one E, right? And again, disease-carrying pests will label D, and rats will label R. So our 3 terms are R, D, and E, right? Okay, so once we've got our terms out of the way, the next step again is to find the conclusion of the argument, right? And again, what we want to do is really look for a kind of conclusion indicator phrase or term here in the passage that will help us see it. So it says here then, rats are disease-carrying pests and as such should be eradicated, because such pests should all be eradicated. So there's a couple of things here. First, I think the key is it says, and as such should be eradicated. The as such really there seems to me to kind of ding, ding, ding. It's that conclusion indicator. The other thing that you can think is that the because that occurs here, a because is always a reason indicator, but it always sort of says that what's following the because is a reason for what precedes it, right? So here we have such pests should be eradicated because such pests should all be eradicated, right? It says something like this anyway. So the because, what it basically says is that it looks like the claim that's the conclusion of the argument has to do with that should be eradicated occurring in the middle of the passage here, right? Now, it's also tricky here because it's kind of hard to see at least what the should be eradicated is referring to, right? It looks like it's referring sort of back to the prior sentence. And so what we want to think about is what is the term that's referring to there? Which are the creatures that should be eradicated? So you read it, it says, rats are disease-carrying pests, and as such should be eradicated. So what it looks like it's really saying there is that the rats should be eradicated, right? And so that's the conclusion of our argument. All rats should be eradicated, essentially. And so we're going to call that claim all R or E, right? All rats are pests that should be eradicated. That's the way we'll translate that. It's a bit tricky, really, but I think that's the way to go. So all R or E is our conclusion. Now, what about our first premise? It says, first, there rats are disease-carrying pests. Well, that seems clearly a claim like all R or D, right? And then lastly, it says, because such pests should all be eradicated. So here it's talking about the terms disease-carrying pests and the things that should be eradicated. It seems to be saying something like all of the disease-carrying pests are things that should be eradicated. And so the claim there will be all D or E. So our argument is going to look like this. All R or D, all D or E, therefore all R or E, right? That's the conclusion. All rats are pests that should be eradicated. Okay, so now if you look at our argument then, I think it's pretty straightforward. Again, at this point, we apply the rules. First rule says that the negatives must match, but you notice here that there are no negatives in this argument. You have 3 A claims. And then, of course, if that's the case, then rule 1 would pass, right? What about rule 2? Rule 2 says the middle term has to be distributed. You notice that the middle term here is the D term, disease-carrying pests. And if you look at the premises of the argument, right, the disease-carrying pest, the D term, it's occurring in the second premise as the subject of an A claim. And that's going to be distributed, right? A claims distribute the subject. So rule 2 is also going to pass. So then, lastly, what about rule 3? Rule 3 says that any term distributed in the conclusion must also be distributed in the premises. So if you notice here that the conclusion distributes the term, the R term, the rats term. But you notice that that term is also distributed in the premises, right? In fact, in both cases, rats occurs as the subject of an A claim, right? It occurs as the subject of an A in the conclusion and as the subject of an A in the first premise. And so it's distributed in both cases. So this actually is a valid argument, right? It's passed all 3 rules, and so the argument is valid, okay? Okay, so for our third example, we have the passage reads like this. None of the intramural sports are sports played in the Olympics, and some of the intercollegiate sports are not Olympic sports either. So therefore, some of the intercollegiate sports are also intramural sports. Here the terms are pretty straightforward, right? You see, in the first claim it says none of the intramural sports are sports played in the Olympics. We can say we have the term intramural sports and the term Olympic sports there. And then if you look at the next part of the passage, it says some of the intercollegiate sports are not Olympic sports either. So we also have the term intercollegiate sports. So the way we're going to label those, the letters we're going to use to abbreviate for those guys, we'll use for intercollegiate sports the letter C for collegiate. For Olympic sports, of course, the letter O. And then for intramural sports, the letter M. Okay? So our terms are M, O, and C. All right? Now, if you think about, again, the next step in the process here, it's find the conclusion and then, put it into standard form, right? So the conclusion here says that some of the intercollegiate sports are also intramural sports. So that looks like, of course, an I claim, something like some C or M, right? Some intercollegiate or intramural, some C or M. And so that's the conclusion of our argument. Now, what about the premises? In the first case, we have the claim none of the intramural sports are sports played in the Olympics. So that kind of looks like an E claim, no M or O, right? And so that's going to be our first premise. Next, we have the claim, and some of the intercollegiate sports are not Olympic sports either. So again, that one, you read it as a sum of the intercollegiate sports are not Olympic, right? So that looks like kind of an O claim, right? Some C are not O. And so that's going to be our second premise. You can see straight away that this argument is going to break rule 1. It's going to break rule 1 because we have 2 negative premises, right? We have an E and an O claim in the premises. Those are both negative. And yet we don't have even a negative conclusion. Okay, and so rule 1 is going to fail, so this argument is going to be invalid straight away. Okay? Now, if you want to think, we know it's invalid, it's failed rule 1. We can think for a minute about rules 2 and 3 just to check our understanding on those rules and apply the rules here. You can see that the middle term for rule 2, the middle term has got to be distributed, and it's actually distributed in both premises, right? The O term is distributed in both premises. You can actually see also that rule 3 passes for this argument because the conclusion of it is an I claim, and I claims don't distribute either term. And so again, when you have the conclusion of an argument as an I, it's going to automatically pass the third rule because it's sort of like, again, the third rule is just this conditional claim. If a term is distributed in the conclusion, it also must be distributed in the premises. But again, with an I claim, we don't have any terms distributed in the conclusion, right? And so the third rule just sort of automatically passes, right? So kind of putting it back into perspective then again, this argument, although it passes rules 2 and 3, it's failed rule 1 because it has 2 negative premises, and so the argument is invalid, okay? So the next example we're going to go over here, and again what we're doing is we're learning how to apply the rules method to test a categorical syllogism to see if it's valid or invalid. And the next example here goes like this. Anyone who voted for the Democrats favors expansion of medical services for the needy. So the people who voted for the Democrats all favor higher taxes, since anyone who wants to expand medical services must favor higher taxes. Okay? Now the terms here obviously getting a bit tricky, right? They're a bit longer. And so this is where we start to see the value of abbreviating the terms with a letter, right? Naming the terms with a letter. Because it's better to work with a letter, of course, than, like a giant phrase, right? Okay, so spotting the terms then, if you read the first sentence here, it says, anyone who voted for the Democrats favors expansion of medical services for the needy. So right there we have a term, people who voted for the Democrats, right? Seems like the first term is something like that. And then it says, any one of those guys favors expansion of medical services for the needy, right? And so then the next term would be something like people who favor expansion of medical services for the needy. I think, again, with an example like this, you have to remember with these types of claims that you're really relating two different types of groups. And so you have to try to pick out somehow the two groups that go into each of these claims. And here it says anyone who voted for the Democrats, which seems to be a kind of group, favors expansion of medical services for the needy, which seems to be a second type of group here. And so the claim is relating those. And so those will be our first two terms here. So people who voted for the Democrats will label D, and people who favor expansion of medical services for the needy will call E, right? Now, the last term, we have to look to the next claim. It says, so the people who voted for the Democrats all favor higher taxes. And again, you have to look at the two groups involved with this claim here, the two categories, right? We have here first the Democrat category, right? People who voted for the Democrats, right? It says that, so the people who voted for the Democrats, that's our D category, right? And then it says all favor higher taxes. So that would be our last term, something about favoring higher taxes. And we would just probably put something like people who favor higher taxes, right? We got to make it that noun phrase, and we've got to attach that noun people to it. So people who favor higher taxes we'll call the letter T, right? And so our three letters here are D, the people who voted for the Democrats, E, the people who favor expansion of medical services for the needy, and T, people who favor higher taxes, right? So D, E, and T. Okay, so then the next step is to find the conclusion of the argument. And again, what we want to do is look for that conclusion indicator. And you have it sort of in the middle of the passage. It says, so, right? That's a conclusion indicator. The people who voted for the Democrats all favor higher taxes. To me, that reads like an A claim when you see the word all in there, right? All favor higher taxes. So to me, I translate that as all D or T, okay? So all the Democrats, or the people who voted for those guys, are the ones who favored the higher taxes, all D or T. Next, the premises then, right? So you've got our conclusion, all D or T. The premises, first, the first part of this passage, it says, anyone who voted for the Democrats, I always take an anyone as a kind of A claim. So anyone who voted for the Democrats, that looks like all D, favors expansion of medical services for the needy. So that looks like the E term, right? So all D or E, Looks like our first premise, right? Then lastly, it says in the last part of this passage, since anyone who wants to expand medical services must favor higher taxes. Again, we have an anyone there, which seems to be an A claim. So the claim looks to be something like all E are T, right? All the people that favor the expansion also favor the higher taxes, right? All E are T. So the premises of our argument, all D are E and all E are T, and then the conclusion is that all D are T, okay? Now the last step here to our method is to check to see if the argument is valid, right? We've got to apply the rules. So rule 1, again, the negatives must match here, right? But you notice that this argument doesn't have any negatives. Okay, there are no negatives here, so we have 3 A claims. Now, secondly, the second rule says that the middle term has to be distributed, right? So far, rule 1 is passed. Rule 2, the middle term has to be distributed. Here, the middle term is the E term, the people who favor the expansion of medical services. And you notice that in the second premise, the E term occurs as the subject of an A claim. And if you remember, A claims distribute the subject term. So actually our middle term is distributed in the second premise. Okay, so that means our second rule is also passed. So far we've passed the first rule and the second, right? What about the third rule? The third rule says that any term distributed in the conclusion has to also be distributed in the premises. You can see here that the D term in the conclusion, right? All D or T is distributed, because A claims distribute the subject. And so we have to check the D term in the premises to see if it's distributed. And you'll notice that it is, right? It's occurring in the first premise as the subject also of an A claim. So it's distributed there as well. And so the argument has actually passed all 3 rules, and it so is, again, a valid one. Okay? So the next example we're going to look at is also, again, the idea here is that we are checking, we're checking to see if these categorical syllogisms are valid or invalid, okay? So the next example starts like this. From time to time, the police have to break up parties here on campus, since some campus parties get out of control. And when a party gets out of control, well, you know what the police have to do, okay? So the first thing we've got to get a handle on are the terms. The terms here, you can see the first claim there, it says, from time to time, the police have to break up parties here on campus. So it looks like the 2 terms there are campus parties and parties the police have to break up, right? Campus parties, parties the police have to break up. So we'll call those C for campus parties, and then we'll have P for parties the police have to break up. And then the last term, it says, to search the passage, it says since some campus parties get out of control, right? And so that's relating the campus parties term to the term something like parties that get out of control, right? And so that's going to be our last term. We'll call that one O. So we've got campus parties C, parties that the police have to break up, which is labeled P, and parties that get out of control, which is labeled O. Okay, so C, P, and O. Now, as far as the translation here and the formalization of the argument, we've got to next find the conclusion. So the conclusion here is, to be honest, I think it's kind of tricky to see, right? Now, I think the easiest way to spot it here is that terms, or that word since, that's occurring in the passage. So if you read it, it says, from time to time, the police have to break up parties here on campus since some campus parties get out of control. So what the since says is that the claim that follows it, which is that some campus parties get out of control, is a reason for the claim that precedes it. So it says from time to time the police have to break up parties here on campus. So actually that first claim there, from time to time the police have to break up parties here on campus, is the conclusion of our argument. Okay? So if we're going to translate that one, you can see that we're talking about campus parties and parties the police have to break up. And it looks kind of like what we're saying is that some of the campus parties are parties the police have to break up, right? So our claim is going to translate as some C or P, right? And that's the conclusion of our argument. Okay, so then to the premises, the next one, it says, since some campus parties get out of control, right? So that one seems to be another I claim, right? Some C, or O. Some campus parties get out of control. Some C or O. So we'll call that the first premise. And then lastly, the second premise, it says, and when a party gets out of control, well, you know what the police have to do, right? When a party gets out of control, well, you know what the police have to do. Well, that kind of reads like an A claim, right? It's like anytime it gets out of control, the police will have to step in and break it up, right? So that looks like an A claim. So it's going to read something like all of the out of control parties are the ones the police have to break up. So that is a claim all O are P. Okay, so that is the second premise. So our argument looks like this: some C are O, and all O are P. Therefore, our conclusion: some C are P. Okay. Now, as far as the rules method goes, the first rule, it says the negatives got to match, right? They have to match, and you can see that there are no negatives here. So the rule 1 is going to pass. Okay. Now, with regard to rule 2, right? You can see here that the middle term in this argument is the O term, right? That's the parties that get out of control term. And because that term is distributed in the second premise, right, it says all O or P, that's the second premise. And that's the O term is the subject of that A claim. And A claims distribute the subject term, so that term is distributed there. So the middle term is actually distributed in the second premise, which means rule 2 passes as well, right? So then lastly, we've got the argument passing rules 1 and 2 so far. So what about rule 3? Rule 3 says that any terms distributed in the conclusion have to be distributed in the premises. But you'll notice here that the conclusion is an I claim, and I claims don't distribute either term. So rule 3 is going to automatically sort of pass, right? Okay, so this example passes rules 1, 2, and 3, so is again valid, right? We have another valid argument. So, okay. So then moving to the next example here, we have the passage here. It says, the trick to finding syllogisms is to think categorically as well as to focus on the key argument in a passage. For example, some passages contain a good bit of rhetoric, and some passages that do this make it hard to spot syllogisms, with the result that it is hard to spot syllogisms in some passages. Now, this one is, I think, particularly tricky because it is hard to find out, discover what the premises in fact are. It takes a bit of work, right? So let's just sort of read into the passage a bit to try to discover the idea of, what these terms are. So the first one, it says, some passages contain a good bit of rhetoric. So what could be the two categories here that we're relating? It says contain a good bit of rhetoric, and it says passages, right? Some passages contain a good bit of rhetoric. So I think the way that we can break that up is we can say that the contain a good bit of rhetoric is one of the categories. And so we can call that one passages that contain a good bit of rhetoric. Okay, passages that contain a good bit of rhetoric. And that'll be our first term, and we'll call that R. Okay, and then the other term in that claim there would be just passages, right? Because it says some passages contain a good bit of rhetoric, right? So we'll have the terms passages, and then also passages that contain a good bit of rhetoric. And we'll call those passages P, and passages that contain a good bit of rhetoric R. Okay? And so far we've got the terms P and R, right? Okay, so then moving on to the next example, it says, and some passages that do this make it hard to spot syllogisms, right? Obviously there we have something having to do with it making it hard to spot syllogisms. And so what we're going to do is label this term passages in which it is hard to spot syllogisms. And so that's going to be our last term, and we'll call that S, okay? Okay, so that all being said, we've got our terms labeled, right? So now the next step is to find the conclusion of the argument. And that's, that's a bit tricky here as well. It says, some passages contain a good bit of rhetoric, and some passages that do this make it hard to spot syllogisms, with the result that, that's a kind of conclusion indicator phrase there. It is hard to spot syllogisms in some passages, okay? So we have there a conclusion, right? It is hard to spot syllogisms in some passages. So here, the translation would be something like an I claim, right? Because you have the term some in there. right? The word some in there. And so we're going to translate as some P are the ones in which it's hard to spot syllogisms S, right? Some P or S, okay? So some P or S is the conclusion of our argument. What about the premises, right? The first claim here, it says some passages contain a good bit of rhetoric. That claim looks quite easily translated as the I claim some P or R. Some P or R. So that is the first premise of our argument. And then if you look on into the passage here, it says, and some passages that do this make it hard to spot syllogisms. Okay? Now, it looks to me like what that claim is about is the ones in which it's containing a good bit of rhetoric and the ones in which it's hard to spot the syllogisms. So to me, what that claim says is that some passages that contain a good bit of rhetoric, some are the ones in which it's hard to spot syllogisms S. So that claim is going to translate as some R or S. So then we have our three claims here. Our premises are that some P or R and some R or S, and then our conclusion is that some P or S. Okay, so that is it looks to be our the formalization of the argument. So then let's apply the rules method to it. Okay, so rule 1 first, right? Rule 1 says that the negatives have to match, and you notice here that there are no negatives in this argument at all, and so that rule is going to pass straight away. What about rule 2? Rule 2 says the middle term has to be distributed. The middle term here is the R term, the rhetoric term, right? But you'll notice that the middle term occurs in 2 I claims, right? So the first premise is an I claim some P or R. The second premise is an I claim some R or S. But I claims don't distribute either term. So what this means then is that the middle term is not distributed in either of the 2 premises. And so this argument fails rule 2. Okay, fails rule 2. And so our next example says, every broadcast network has seen its share of the television audience decline during the past 6 years, but not every broadcast network that has a decline in television audience share has lost money. So not every broadcast network has lost money. Now again, the first step here is to determine the terms of this argument. And I think a great place to start really is, in fact, actually the last sentence of the passage. It says, so not every broadcast network has lost money. You can see there that the terms that are related in that claim was broadcast network and something like lost money, right? So we can have, I think here, one term as broadcast networks and the other as broadcast networks that have lost money, right? So, that's one, I think, sort of tip here with this one in particular is that I think it's quite easy to see the terms with the last sentence of the passage. And then what we can do is just from there we can move to find the third term by looking at the other parts of the passage. So the first sentence, it says every broadcast network has seen its share of the television audience decline during the past 6 years. Now if you take, with this claim here, if you take one of the terms to be broadcast networks, the B term, right, then the other term would have to kind of pick out all the rest of that claim, which is that has seen its share of the television audience decline during the past 6 years. So what we can say then is that our term is something like broadcast networks that have seen their share of the television audience decline during the past 6 years. Okay, we'll call that one for television, we'll call that one the T term. Broadcast networks we're going to call the B term, and broadcast networks that have lost money the M term. So our 3 terms then are B, T, and M. Okay. Now, again, the next step in the process is to find the conclusion of the argument. And you can see here that there is, in the last sentence of this passage, a conclusion indicator in so. It says, so not every broadcast network has lost money. So the claim we're dealing with here is not every broadcast network has lost money. For me, the not every claims translate as O claims, some are not. And so our translation here is going to be some broadcast networks are not, some Bs are not broadcast networks that have lost money, M, right? So our conclusion is going to translate as some B are not M, okay? Now, as far as our premises go, the first claim there, it says every broadcast network has seen its share of the TV audience decline during the past 6 years. That's going to be an all claim, right? Every broadcast network, right? All broadcast networks. So it's going to translate as all B are the TV audience decline term, all BRT, okay? So our first premise is all BRT. The next premise, it says, but not every broadcast network that has a decline in TV audience share has lost money. Again, we're dealing with a not every claim, which is going to translate as an O. And your terms here are the T term and the M term, right? So you're going to have a sum of the ones that have a decline in TV audience share are not the ones that have lost money. Some T are not M, right? So we have all B are T, some T are not M, therefore some B are not M as our conclusion. Okay, so now just sort of checking the rules, right? Rule 1, the number of negatives must match. We have a negative premise with premise 2, and we also had a negative conclusion. So then the rule 1 is going to pass because the negatives match each other. Rule 2, the middle term has to be distributed. The middle term here is the T term, the term about the networks that have lost, have a decline in TV audience over the past 6 years, right? That term is actually occurring in the first premise as the predicate of an A, so it is not distributed in the first premise. In the second premise, it occurs as the subject of an O claim, and that is not distributed either. So this example, this categorical syllogism actually fails rule 2, right? The middle term T isn't distributed in either premise, okay? So, okay, that brings us to the last example that we'll look at for today. And so this example, it says, it isn't important to learn chemistry since it isn't very useful, and there isn't much point in learning something that isn't useful. So the first thing we have to do here is sort the terms, and that's really, I think, probably the trickiest thing here. Obviously, we have a term that has to do with chemistry. So what we're going to say is that term is things identical to chemistry, and that'll pick out the right category for this example. The next thing you can see in our first claim, first bit of that first example, it says it isn't important to learn chemistry. So I think here what we can do is we can label the next term as things that are important to learn, and we'll call that the I term. Then you can see the next part of the passage says, since it isn't very useful. So I think the last term, what we'll do is we'll phrase the last term as useful things, right? Or things that are useful or something, and we'll call that U. So our three terms are things identical to chemistry, C, things that are useful, which is U, and things that are important to learn, which we're going to call I, right? So we have C, U, and I. Now, the next step is to go to the conclusion of our argument. It says here, I think also this is a tricky one, right? So the passage says, it isn't important to learn chemistry since it isn't very useful, and there isn't much point in learning something that isn't useful. It's actually a bit hard to see what the conclusion here is unless you, again, look at the reason, the premise indicator there, since. Again, for since, what it says is that what's after is a reason for what's before, essentially. So then we can see then that tells us the conclusion of our argument is that it isn't important to learn chemistry, right? It is important to learn chemistry. And I think the way we want to translate that one is as an E claim, right? And something like no C or I, right? No things that are identical to chemistry are important to learn, okay? So that's going to be the conclusion of our argument, no C or I. Now, as far as the premises go, right? The next part of the argument, it says, since it isn't very useful, right? It's again talking about chemistry, and it's saying it's not very useful. So our premise there is going to be no C or U, right? No things identical to chemistry are useful. Okay. Lastly, we have then the claim that there isn't much point in learning something that isn't useful. Okay. So this is a kind of a tricky one, right? There isn't much point in learning something that isn't useful. So you have here a kind of a double negative, right? A double negative. So for me, when I have a double negative, what I do is I just kind of cancel the negatives, cancel each other, and so the claim becomes like an A claim, right? An A claim. So the question then is the claim all I are you or all you are I, right? And again, if we read it, it says there isn't much point in learning something that isn't useful, right? So to me, what that says is that all the useful things are important to learn, right? Since there isn't much point in learning something that isn't useful. So when it's useful, it's important. So that's going to translate as all you or I, right? Okay, so then our claims here, our premises, all you or I, and no C or U, and then our conclusion is that no C or I. Okay, so now to the rules, we can see straight away that this one passes rule 1 because the second premise is negative, but so is the conclusion. Now with regard to rule 2, right, the middle term here is the U term, and it's actually distributed in both of the premises. It's distributed in the first premise as the subject of an A claim, and then it's distributed in the second premise as the predicate of an E claim, right? E claims distribute both terms. So this one actually passes rules 1 and 2. What about rule 3 though? So rule 3 says if a term is distributed in the conclusion, it's got to be distributed in the premises. You can see that the conclusion distributes both terms, C and I. So if we look first to the C term, right, it occurs in the second premise as well as the subject of an E claim. And of course, E claims distribute both terms. So the C term is fine, right? It's distributed in both the conclusion but also the second premise. Now what about the I term, right? The I term distributed in the conclusion, but notice the I term is not distributed in the first premise there, and it is not distributed in the first premise because it's occurring as the predicate of an A claim, right? And so this argument actually fails rule 3. It's passed rules 1 and 2, but it fails rule 3, so it is actually invalid, right? Okay, well that'll do it for today, I think with the practice that you got here in the video, and then hopefully you can take these skills and work some more exercises on your own. You should become proficient at using this rules method to apply them to the rules to categorical syllogisms to check to see if they're valid or invalid now. And hopefully that will help you. And hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks so much.